So today is the second Sunday of Advent, and as we have just heard, and is always the case every year on the second Sunday of Advent, we hear about John the Baptist. Now, he was not actually a Baptist as we think of that term. It probably would be better to call him John the Baptizer, or he's often referred to as John the Forerunner, because he was the forerunner of Jesus. He said he came to prepare the way of the Lord. To prepare the way of the Lord. And that's what I want to think about with you for a few minutes today. Because every time John the Baptist comes up, and his particular role in preparing the way of the Lord in his day, I think about people who have prepared the way of the Lord for me in my life. So I'm going to tell you about one of them, and perhaps it'll help you to reflect on someone or more than one person like that in your life. Because I've had in the last year, some of the most significant mentors in my life have died in the past year. So I've been particularly aware of them. And the one that I'm thinking about today died almost a year ago, just before Christmas. He was 100 years old. Father Bob Orpin. He was the priest that I trained under in the inner city in Chicago during seminary years. And he's one of the people that prepared the way of the Lord for me. He came from the East Coast, but after a few years of beginning in different places in his ordained ministry, he landed in Chicago in the Logan Square neighborhood in the inner city. And that used to be quite a posh neighborhood. It was primarily Jewish and people of English descent, which is why they had a beautiful Episcopal church there. But during his time, the neighborhood was changing. And it was becoming very different. The pastor of the big Roman Catholic church down the street said, here's the way to describe our neighborhood right now. Our masses are in English, our funerals are in Polish, and our baptisms are in Spanish. And after growing up in Corey, in a nice little sleepy small town where I grew up, and I was terrified of a city like Chicago, by the time it was time for me to actually go and do training, I was ready to take it on. I wanted to go right into the inner city, dangerous as it was in that neighborhood. He and his wife, Vinnie, had a long-term commitment to staying in that neighborhood no matter what, ups and downs, through thick and thin. And so he was the rector of that parish for nearly 30 years. And when they retired, they moved to the Diocese of Chicago's equivalent of Brevoort Village, which was still on the south side in Hyde Park, a little bit nicer area to live than Logan Square. So here are some things that I took from him that prepared the way for me. The first one was what I just said. A long-term commitment to a place. No matter what. Ups and downs, through thick and thin, whatever changes may come along. The Benedictines call that stability. Stability in place. Second thing that I took from him was an absolute meticulous attention to detail when it came to worship. No matter what the occasion, no matter how many people might be there, absolute attention to detail about every aspect of what was going to happen. He wrote out these directions for the Holy Week services. Every single thing was going to happen, how it would go, and who would do what. Those directions took longer to read than it actually took to do the service. But man, we knew what we were doing when we went in there for the Holy Week services. So an absolute attention to detail. And the third thing was a commitment to prayer. He was a priest, and so he was highly committed to reading the daily office as the framework for his daily prayers and to how everything leads up to the Sunday Eucharist and flows back from it again into the week to come. In fact, when Sharon and I went to visit the two of them about 10-ish years ago, so he was around 90 at the time, and they were living in their little apartment at Montgomery Place. The first thing he wanted to show me was the corner of his room where he had a prayer desk set up. He said, "This is where I say my prayers." That was the first thing he wanted to show me in his apartment. So those are three things that I took from him, and they're all, if you think about it, they're all about being grounded, about being stable, about being committed to something. And in a strange way, it's those very commitments, that very grounding, that also made him a very open person. As I said, the neighborhood was changing. It was becoming more and more Hispanic. He had no background in any of that. But he realized when he started hearing more Spanish on the street than English that he needed to do something. So he asked for a leave of absence, and he went to an immersion class, and he came back being able to speak Spanish. And he started a Spanish mass at noon on Sunday mornings. Just put a sign out front in Spanish saying, "Mass in Spanish at 12 o'clock. And a congregation started to assemble. One of the members of the congregation was Sammy Sosa's mother. Those of you who are baseball followers will remember Sammy Sosa. He played for both the White Sox and the Cubs in Chicago. He wasn't a church person, but his mother was, and she dragged him, great big guy as he was, into that church to be baptized. So a little congregation began to develop. Father Orpin also, though he was formed as the most staunch high church Anglo-Catholic you could imagine, he was open to the new relationship with the Lutherans that was beginning to be born in those days. And there was a Lutheran church just half a block down the street, and they began doing things together from the beginning of that relationship. Here's the outcome of that. The Church of the Advent, a while after his retirement, maybe 20 years or so after he retired, through the most noble efforts of the diocese you could imagine, still had to close. But the Spanish-speaking congregation is still going, and it meets for worship at the Lutheran Church. Second way that he was open that I remember was with all the issues that came to the Episcopal Church during that particular era. From the ordination of women to sexuality issues, we know all of those things. And he, with a pastor's heart, worked his way through to how he was going to understand and be open to those changes. So these are all things that characterized him, a groundedness and an openness. And I can see in my own life how I've walked several of those same paths because I saw his example, preparing the way. Not in everything. He hated to preach. I love to preach. I'm not going to learn Spanish at this point in my life, and I would have no real value to offer if I did. So it isn't being a clone of someone like that for me or for you. It's following in their footsteps in some ways and just learning from them in other ways, preparing the way. But that's not everything that John the Baptist said. He said, preparing the way of the Lord. So let me tell you one more story about Father Bob. We were taking a day to do home communions, and in the city, that takes quite a while to get from one house to another around the neighborhoods. So it's a day's work just to do 2 or 3 home communions. And we went to this one household, and there was an older couple in there, a man and a woman, older people. And We did the whole thing, chatted for a while, did communion. We're walking back out to the car afterwards, and Father Orpin said to me, I don't know if they're married or not, but I long ago made the decision that if I'm going to make a mistake, it's going to be on the side of being too charitable rather than too judgmental. If I'm going to make a mistake, it's going to be on the side of charity rather than judgment. And I've tried to live that. I know imperfectly, but I've tried to live that way. It made a deep impression on me. That was gospel. That was the grace of God that we know through Jesus Christ, that accepts us as we are and then loves us into what we will be. Not that waits until we have it all together before we're acceptable. Accepts us when we don't have anything together, and then loves us into what we will grow into. So in that moment, he prepared the way of the Lord for me. Not just how to be a priest and a good way to live it out and one that kind of fit with me, but the gospel in a way that made such a deep impression on me. I'm sharing it here with you today, over 40 years later. This is what these people do in our lives. This is what the people that maybe you thought of now in your life have done for you. They show us a way, and to a certain degree, we may walk that same way because we saw them do it. They opened up that path and we walked on that path. Or if we didn't exactly follow that path, we learned from what they did in a way that influenced us. But even more importantly, they somehow communicated to us the grace of God through the Lord Jesus Christ. They prepared the way, but they prepared the way of the Lord. So today's a day we give thanks for them. Wouldn't it be fun if we could all share our stories with each other, what we would learn from each other? Because there's probably more stories in this room than there are people in this room of folks who have done that. Today we give thanks for John the Baptist and for all the people in our lives like him who prepared the way of the Lord.